and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. How can colleges and universities creatively leverage new trends in finance, in technology, in real estate, in NIL? This conversation provides valuable insight from longtime higher ed consultants, Baker Tilly's Adrienne Lermet and Dave Capitano. We discuss mergers and acquisitions, reimagining too much or too little housing space on campus. We discuss should private equity and NIL deals include private off-campus housing for college athletes and other emerging ideas. Dave and Adrienne have worked alongside Division I, II, and III campuses as they wrestle with these new challenges. It's an interesting way to consider the new ways campuses are becoming more resilient in the 21st century. Adrienne and Dave, welcome back to the podcast. It's been a few months. We thought maybe we'd have calm waters over the summer. Not so much. Dave, what's your take on the work that you've been doing with AGB and NCUBO?
Yeah, Karen, we do appreciate being back. Love this conversation. Love what you're doing on the podcast and informing the group. So yeah, when we were together in April, we really talked about some of the pressures that we're seeing with top leadership. And like you said, those pressures don't go away, right? You can't turn your head to the blind eye to them and just hope they go away. So we've been pretty active over the last couple of months with regards to our outreach and our ability to connect with a lot of these leaders, particularly through some major association involvements. We had a speaking engagements with AGB at their annual conference, and we just got back from NCUBO's annual conference. Again, speaking to hundreds of different leaders across the U.S. And the theme is the same. The pressures are there. We could go down the bullet list of what we're seeing, everything from financial pressures to student health, mental health and wellness, to the issues around NIL and student athletes, compliance, legal issues. They go on and on. But the common theme is that people are addressing those realities head on. That is the positive note right now. And more importantly, there's a community of individuals that are coming together, not just the board, not just the leaders, but a variety of individuals that come together to think through and deals with these challenges. So I'm very optimistic about the fact that we're addressing these realities head on, and that we're surrounding ourselves with the talent that we need to be educated on these challenges and the solutions.
That's a great point. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of those conversations. You don't have to give us institutions or names, but how are they handling this? What kinds of people are they bringing on board? How are they restructuring their leadership teams or involving their board more? Give us a little bit of an idea of how that's looking.
All right, and I'll start, Adrienne, and then maybe you could jump in. So let's deal with the really interesting topic of mergers, acquisitions, and consolidations, right?
Right.
Three years ago, just literally 3 years ago, you would not have that conversations. Boards did not want to address it. And now it's a pretty regular agenda item on a board meeting, right? Mm-hmm. So not only is the board saying to leadership, we need to have a merger strategy, and it could be a buy or a sell side of that equation, but they're looking at that through a different perspective. Not that it's a bad thing, but it's a reality. And how do we address it? How do we deal it? Maybe it doesn't change anything going forward, but we're putting it on the agenda as a potential item that needs to be considered. So I think that's a really positive, tangible example of how the mindset of these leaders is changing.
Yeah, I think, Dave, that's a really good point. And, where maybe they were hesitant historically, now they're actively talking about it. I think some of the lessons that we've learned when we've actually been in the discussion rooms with those senior leaders is that they not only need to think about how they're going to join their institutions, but how they're going to join their operations. I think where we see a lot of organizations fall down is, yes, they might want to join at a strategic or a mission level, but they're still operating as distinct organizations. And so when we think through a lot of the challenges right now that we're seeing in higher education, just even from a people resources standpoint, I think not only we need to not only be not afraid, rather to, be willing to go down this path, but think about how we're really going to merge the organizations, because otherwise we're not going to necessarily realize a lot of the benefits of combining, especially from a fiscal standpoint.
In the Philadelphia area, we've had 3 institutions acquire, merge, buy out. We've had St. Joseph's University acquire the University of the Sciences. We've had Cabrini selling its land, I believe, to Villanova, at which they're only a couple miles apart from each other. And also Drexel is merging with Salus University, which is primarily a medical campus. So it's an interesting time to be thinking more abstractly about what your weaknesses are, maybe as an institution, and where you can gain some strengths by looking outside of your campus walls. Dave, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the great examples that you just went through, Karen, here in Pennsylvania. So it brings to the question, the monetization of the infrastructure of these campuses. So, all these schools have acres and acres of property, some already developed, some undeveloped. But there's probably not a week doesn't go by that we're not talking to schools or schools calling us and say, how do I get smarter about using my space and my infrastructure, whether it's internally and how they're using it. There was a great example in the press this morning about an institution that is actually their enrollment has increased since COVID because they did a aggressive online programming. But they said to themselves, our enrollment's going up, but no one's on campus. So maybe I need to sell my infrastructure and look at it a different way. So monetization of that infrastructure is really a hot topic right now, and figuring out how do we utilize it? How does it become more efficient? Senior living services, we're seeing individuals partnering with organizations like that, really kind of putting the conversation in the room with regards to the community, the local government, the needs of the workforce, and how do we combine their efforts to utilize space. There's all kinds of examples that we could point to where people are getting real aggressive in that area.
Well, give us a couple. I mean, that's certainly a lot of these more rural campuses have lots of land, but they have, not a great large city next to them. It's a very rural area, but yet their state legislators don't want to see the university close or move. So how are they specifically addressing some of these issues involving the real deal of having real estate that is too valuable to give up?
Yeah. So there's a couple of examples that recently done in the last year and a half that I'm aware of, where schools have looked particularly in tax advantaged areas. So schools that have moved into city limits and utilized previously unutilized property and developed different schools or different colleges within those programs in those particular buildings. So that use of undeveloped real estate in particular areas that are, I'll call them disadvantaged, or maybe there's an advantage to do that. That's a big priority. Hotels being revented into different types of spaces. And then undeveloped property that's being sold off and built in a commercial perspective. So we've seen schools take property where 10 years ago, there was nothing. And now today there's a movie theater, there's a Dick's, there's a Home Depot, there's a Panera. And then the population of people that work in there are the students from the colleges. So there's a lot of examples of doing that, but it takes a lot of work with regards to that connection with the community and the local government to make those things happen.
Adrienne, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Dave is saying. What we're also observing is not only is it an opportunity to monetize, but oftentimes to tie back to like the strategic objectives of the institution. So you might see strategic objectives around research and having students participate in research. And so what we're seeing through these monetization activities is also these partnerships and exploration into different research activities that maybe the institution had only kind of briefly touched a little bit, really, but an opportunity to dig in. So like Dave was talking about the partnerships with, senior living, right? Well, so not only are you having the opportunity to, have these facilities on campus or campus adjacent, but now you have access potentially to a population of individuals that might be willing to participate in research pertaining to, geriatric medicine. Or you might now have access to a school, and that could open avenues for, education research or autism research. So we're now seeing not only, like I said, the monetization, but these new partnerships and these added benefits, not only for faculty, but also for students to then participate in further. So it's a multifaceted, beneficial approach these institutions are taking.
Very creative, very creative. Let me ask you, a couple of years ago, I did an interview with one of the Chronicle of Higher Education's reporters, Karen Fisher. We were talking about some of these campus adjacent properties that were adding and building more off-campus apartments, more energy and excitement, around shopping spaces and gathering spaces. And it seemed like there was a move in that direction to try to build more adjacent to campus. Are you still seeing that kind of movement, or is it about repurposing what they have?
I would say, Karen, there's definitely a combination of both of those things, depending on where you're at and where you're sitting in type of real estate you have, or whether you're urban or suburban community. It really depends. But the big point is they're thinking differently about how they're interacting with that real estate. I think that's the number one point that we're really trying to emphasize here. The use of the space or how they're doing it more, I think the conversation really needs to move to how they're utilizing capital resources to get it done, right? So the traditional taxes and financing, traditional banking, or doing a campaign to get donors to back it up, those things still exist, but really trying to think differently. What do those third-party arrangements look like? Private equity, where do these private equity firms come in, and how aggressive are they being in this environment, and how schools could utilize that? So really thinking about where the capital resources are coming from to help fund some of these is a big part of the conversation.
I think one of the things we see, though, is also kind of these living learning spaces that are slowly adapting to meet the way academic programming is now being offered. How is curriculum being offered? What is delivery? I think where students used to go to class all the time and maybe work a little bit together outside. Now they're watching all of their lectures on streaming or YouTube or whatever the professor or faculty member has recorded, and then going and getting together with their classmates in some type of collaborative environment. And as we talk to provost and other dean of academic affairs, it's how do we adapt our current space that has been developed and maybe old, outdated, or whatnot. And as we're thinking today's point about our capital planning, how do we align that space that we have to meet whatever the curriculum of tomorrow is going to be? And I think a lot of faculty members and academic leaders are kind of trying to think through what that's going to be to remain competitive.
Yeah.
It's absolutely a fascinating topic. I mean, I really hadn't considered the depth of the change that could happen and all the different financing resources that you might have in this as well. What other opportunities are out there right now that you're having conversations with clients and also industry leaders about?
Well, I'll tell you one interesting one on the topic that we just talked about is on housing. So the housing situation is very interesting because you have some that are really suffering and can't fill the residence halls, and you have others that are trying to figure out where to put these students, right?
Right.
So a really interesting example of that was two schools on both ends of spectrums within 30 miles of each other that actually figured out a way to rent the dorms from the other institution that wasn't filling it and putting their students in. So think about that. Two competing schools that have basically competed for students their whole lives, now partnering up to utilize unutilized residence halls so that they don't have to create new debt service and create new buildings. So that's a nice thing to see.
Absolutely. That's very interesting. I hear a lot about this the cost of housing in so many areas of the country has just gone up to the roof that people can't even afford to rent. So what's the impact that that's having on college students and also even faculty and staff?
There's certainly and I'll tee up Adrienne on this one. There's also the whole issue with the safety of these residence halls, right?
Right.
So let's park the technology side of it. Are they, do they have and meet all the requirements that the students want? But the pure safety of it. Now, I have two children in college right now. One of them gave me a tour of his fraternity, and I thought to myself, where is the college administration right now? Because I don't know how they're letting anybody go into this building, right?
Right.
So safety is a big issue. So I know, Adrienne, that's a big side of what you're seeing with regards to the risk side of the equation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Karen, to your point, I mean, the cost of housing students, feeding students is increasing significantly, and it goes to the broader discussion around the cost of education, which then impacts the discussion around the value of a college degree, which is hurting, I think, the industry broadly. And as we continue to see states remove kind of those barriers to, obtaining state jobs, not requiring a college degree, a 4-year degree and whatnot, it's really complicating things. But I think, we continue to see students that either can't afford to attend an institution, and that really impacts their decision, and then spirals and the impacts on the institution, or they struggle through. Maybe they're having housing insecurity or other subsistence challenges, which again impacts their ability to be present in their degree, impacts the retention. It impacts persistence, and then ultimately still impacts the institution. And I don't know if institutions have fully figured out this problem. I mean, as Dave talked about, they're being more creative. If there's the demand, how can we accommodate that? But institutional resources continue to be challenged to provide students with the added support. And I'm not sure anybody has the answer yet. But like Dave kicked off at the beginning, I mean, everybody's talking about it.
Yeah.
So.
Real estate and housing strike me as two of have the most upside, but also the most challenge in terms of the marketplace that you're in. So are there any characteristics in the markets that you've studied that seem to lend themselves to more innovation versus sort of staying with the status quo?
No, I'll start. I think there's certainly differences between some of our private institutions and our public schools, where the property is a little bit more encumbered with regards to the governmental ownership. So there's those issues as well. I think it's all about location, right? So that's the common theme. So where are you at with regards to your ability to expand? We see a lot of schools are right in the middle of cities, but they're landlocked with regards to their ability to do anything. And then we see others that are out in the middle of nowhere, and you wonder why anybody would even travel there, right? There's nothing around for the students. So there's certainly a different combination, but being able to really identify your location benefits with the demographics of the students that you're attracting is the strategic connection. So if don't be in the city and tell me you're attracting kids that want to be outside of the city, right? It's just like, it seems really common, or maybe very not surprising to people to think that way, but you'll be surprised that your recruiting efforts don't necessarily align with your benefits from a location.
I would also add, though, to Dave, not only the demographics from where you're recruiting, but also the socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds of the students that you're recruiting, because there may not be the expectation to have that residential experience. Culturally, that might not be something that is just expected as part of the academic experience. So I think, to your point, really understanding the students in your market that you're pulling from.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen schools that were located in strategic areas where they had really valuable real estate that could probably been totally demolished and turned into something else by any commercial developer, right? And then we've seen other schools that couldn't give away their property just because of the location, and they got to figure out a whole different strategy.
You mentioned developers, and of course here in Philadelphia and in University City, we have a ton of public-private partnerships. I mean, it's amazing how much universities have and colleges have worked with that. Just explain to our listeners what that is. What does that mean for research? What does that mean for housing? What does that mean for space? Those kinds of things.
So the P3 or the pub, that concept that's utilized is basically an arrangement between the institution and a third party that they're partnering with to get the advantages of both of them. So if you're looking at a housing situation, for example, an institution may say, look, I don't have the current debt capacity to build a new residence hall, but I have potential resident students that I need to put somewhere. So a third-party developer may come into the picture and say, look, I will build a residence hall, and they work out different arrangements to guarantee revenue flows between both of them so they both could benefit from that. So schools are getting very strategic in how they're working with people. I mean, it gets a lot more complex, but that's the basic arrangement where you're trying to partner with a third party for a mutual benefit to both of you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also we see land that's owned by the university being turned over to research institutes and things like that, where the university sells a long-term lease to that company. You've seen that as well?
Absolutely. So that's the strategy around the arrangement. The compliance over the contractual relationships, the details of the contractual relationships, the monitoring of those contractual relationships. That's where Adrienne and her team come in to make sure all that gets done in the proper way.
And what's interesting is, as these P3 relationships have proliferated, we've seen a lot of challenges in the operational compliance, because you have institutional students living in this building or this facility that may be managed by the third party, but where does the line, where's the line drawn in terms of who's supposed to respond to if you have a sexual assault? It's right. ADA accommodations that need to be made and potentially managed for living facilities. Any type of wellness incident that could potentially occur. How does that work? Are you going to potentially call down to the front desk, which may be managed by a third-party security? Do you alert the university? It's really complex, and a lot of institutions are still working to figure that out as they've entered these relationships. So we spent a lot of time helping them think through it.
Yeah, and I would think every building is different, right? Because it depends on what the contract is, what the relationship is, how long the leases are for the students, those kinds of things.
Absolutely. And then whose responsibility for recruiting tenants potentially. Right. And if the institution can't provide enough tenants from the student population, well, when is that potentially opened up to the rest of the public? And what potential issues could that potentially create, whether real or an appearance for students and families and different things like that?
One of the things that I've certainly watched over the years is that, special housing is oftentimes built off campus just for athletes, and the NCAA for years had a rule that said no more than 50% of a residence hall could be comprised of student athletes. But once you go off campus, whoever wants to live together can live together. So have you heard of any discussions around this idea of housing the basketball team together or housing the football team, all 120 of them together in different kinds of arrangements?
Well, I'll tell you, there's always been that theory out there. So not only the athletes, but different, the business school, the more academic diversity and different populations, the fraternities that we talked about. So there's always that issue with regards to trying to get those like-minded individuals in common areas to help with the building, help with the retention. So I get all that. I think in this current day and age, with regards to our continually challenge our diversity strategies, this is where the conversation gets much more interesting. And it probably tails into our NIL conversations around where that money's being given. I mean, you could imagine the current environment where our NIL collective is building a brand new building just to house the football players because they want them in that and use that as a recruiting tool. I mean, how does that play with your diversity strategy? So I get it that it makes sense with regards to really wanting to build that camaraderie with regards to those particular groups, but man, it better make sense with regards to your diversity strategy.
It's a really good point. I had a podcast conversation with Jason Belzer a couple weeks ago, who's the CEO of the Student Athlete NIL Summit that's been held the last 2 years in Atlanta. And one of the things that he foresees that athletes who have NIL opportunities might end up getting real estate partnerships and be able to leverage that like a portfolio item, just like a professional athlete has different things in their portfolios these days. I know it's really kind of out there, but when we're talking so much about real estate, could you see a day where an external organization says that in order to have an NIL, you need to live here because we're all going to do our creating our NIL together here?
I certainly would not put it by the current thinking. I mean, we're seeing things in the current environment that we never thought we would see, 6, 8, 12 months ago. So it is an interesting thought process. And then you fast forward to what are all the ramifications of doing that, right? Our radar went through the roof when these NIL collectives start popping up 12 months ago. And now we have this IRS out there challenging their nonprofit status, right? So I'm gonna claim the fifth on this one and wait to see what happens. But I just think that's an interesting philosophy.
I think the most important thing, though, is whatever happens is making sure that the student athletes are prepared from a financial literacy standpoint to understand what their responsibilities are once they engage in these activities. I think a lot of the activities, or a lot of support now that Baker Tilly is providing, is the tax support and the financial literacy training to these athletes. Because now that we're a month in and they've been successful and they've made some income, it's like, welcome to adulthood. You now have to pay taxes on that, and it's a learning process for them. It's a learning process, potentially for their parents, because different types of income and different things. So to Dave's point, absolutely, I think anything is possible. I think we just need to, from the institutional perspective, make sure that we're giving those students the training that they need to be prepared.
Yeah, I mean, Karen, we certainly know that schools have certain requirements for their students to live on campus during, their freshman years, or, those types of requirements, or sometimes all the, populations have to be in a certain spot. So we understand that, but having a third party kind of dictated, I don't know where that's going to go.
Yeah, it's really a very interesting area. The other thing, of course, is all of this last minute scramble to try to get some legislation on the books to overseeing NIL, trying to get some guardrails so that maybe agents have to register, or there's a national database that's anonymous that allows people to see what the marketplace is shaping out to be. What are you hearing from your conversations about these ideas are out there? Is that kind of what your leaders are saying to you?
So there's definitely a cry for more regulation. There's no doubt about that. And Adrienne could talk a little bit more about some of the conversations he's having. So there's definitely a desire to have guardrails around it. I would tell you that it went in the beginning, there was more individuals kind of on the fence with regards to, I'm not sure I want the guardrails, I want a little bit of flexibility. And the more we're seeing a lot more people seeing that say, hey, we need something right now. We really need to control this on where it's going, particularly around the NIL conversation. I think the other part about it is every time something like this comes on the plate of your administration, your leadership team, it takes away from all the other things that they're trying to address. And I think that gets back to the conversation we had in April, is that how could you keep adding these things to the plate with regards to what these administrators need to worry about without giving them some direction? Because otherwise they're just out there trying to figure a lot of things out and spending maybe unnecessary time doing it.
Could not agree more. In fact, I read through the collaborative report that you did with AGB and Nakubo last year about, the board, the president, the CFO working together to understand really what fiduciary responsibility it is. And it sounds like the presidents in this situation, whether it's NIL or whether it's, a public-private partnership, has to have a really strong team around them in order to really navigate this. What are some best practices in that area?
Adrienne, do you want to start?
Absolutely. I mean, I think first and foremost, it's always really important to take a step back and understand what your strategy is. You can't really put a team around it, put anything in place unless you understand the direction that you're going. As Dave has said many times, I mean, the goal of many institutions, most is, student success, right? But how are we going to get there? So it's having a really clear understanding of what the strategy is and having a consensus of all of those parties that you just mentioned, that this is where we're going to go, because you're not able to put into place, an effective shared governance and go in the same direction. But I think, Dave, from what we've seen, it's a collaborative approach from senior leaders, from board members that are engaged in the process, always having the faculty perspective, because it is higher education and that's the way many institutions work. But also making sure to get some of those other key stakeholders involved, their perspectives, not only students as your key customer base, but perspectives from families, since it's really a massive investment on behalf of the entire family unit to be able to put students through. And also having a recognition back to Dave's point, what he was talking about, of the position in the community and understanding where you are. So I think you need to understand the strategy, be in agreement, and then make sure that your working group is reflective of those key viewpoints. Dave?
Yeah, sticking with our athletic theme, if you're putting together a roster for your team, you're always looking for the top talent that kind of fits those gaps, the right quarterback, the right defensive end, whoever it may be. I think a little bit different in regards to putting together your board is that leadership teams are more astute to challenging themselves with regards to the level of diversity of thought on that group. So they're not just surrounding themselves with yes people that'll agree with the direction they need to go in. They're smart enough to surround themselves with a diversity of thought so they get challenged in a lot of areas. And while it's not always difficult or sometimes difficult for these top leaders to hear those types of controversial thoughts come in, they need it and they appreciate it. So challenging the board is top of mind of a lot of leaders right now. Shaping that board in a way that gives them the diversity of thought is second with regards to what we're seeing as a positive change.
Some really strong advice there. As we wrap up the podcast, is there anything else out there in the ecosphere that you're seeing that really gives you hope and a chance to consider more opportunities for institutions of higher learning?
Yeah, artificial intelligence. So we could spend the whole podcast on artificial intelligence, data gathering, everything from the stuff that athletes are submitting with regards to all these wearables that they have on, to artificial intelligence in the classroom, being able to use it for retention and recruiting efforts. It is a whole new world out there that is going to be really interesting to dive into.
Absolutely. Adrienne, how about you?
I want to second Dave in all of that. I mean, I think we're just really seeing a lot of creativity, which higher education is really good at, right? Or an incubator of thought about how we can take this new technology tool, this enhancement, to not only be creative and innovative, but also to shore up areas where we haven't had coverage. So, like I had talked about earlier, the human resource deficit, we just don't necessarily have the people or even the resources to have the people anymore. Well, there are a lot of tools now that are being put in place to support this. Going back to NIL, there's potentially, with the federal regulations, a lot of data reporting requirements. And I don't know how often you talk to your IR folks, your institutional research folks, but they do a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
they do. They're not a lot of people to do a lot of things. And so to see how they're implementing AI in their day-to-day things to be more productive and get the data to the end users, whoever that is, it's really fascinating. So I'm excited to see how higher ed uses this, not only for innovation, but just to improve overall. It's going to be cool to watch.
Absolutely. Well, listen, you guys, it is always great to talk with you. You get my brain thinking about what the possibilities are, what the challenges, and what the opportunities are. And I'm grateful for your time and your expertise for my listenership. Thank you both for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Karen. We love
Thank
being on the
you.
podcast.